Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thank you so much for being here. A busy week in BC politics. We have a reset, a narrative reset by Premier David Eby in more ways than one, a cabinet shuffle, and the government trying to get out from what has been one of the most damaging political stories in quite a long time, restoring drugs to a dying 10-year-old girl in Langford. We're going to talk about those stories. We're going to bring in the panel to break it all down. Allie Blades, Jillian Oliver, and Jeff Ferrier are here. Thank you, as always, for being here. We'll get to the cabinet shuffle in a second. I did want to just start with, we've talked about the case of 10-year-old Charlie Pollock before. Rare disease, the only person in BC with a terminal brain disease called Batten disease. 5 months of fighting the government to get certainty that she can have the drug that is bringing her and her family and her care team, says quality of life in her final year or two. Government moved finally on this issue. We'll go around and ask why you think that was. The premier cited this sort of letter that he got from basically the world's experts, 13 folks with big PhDs and titles from across the United States, saying that the government was wrong, and he seemed to take that off-ramp. But there were so many other off-ramps, Allie, on this file. How did this get out of control for government, and were you surprised to see them kind of move on this at the last minute?
You know, the special part about all of this is that for the last few weeks, have you been part of a conversation with anyone that hasn't talked about Charlie? Like, everyone on social media around the dinner table has talked about her and her family and all of the efforts that they've made. The GoFundMe, a bunch of restaurants chipping in for different specials, trying to fundraise, and everyone getting involved. And that's exactly what was needed here to apply pressure to government. And so I'm glad that they changed their decision on this. What this really means is that I hope that there is a cabinet meeting sometime soon where they talk about how they massively went wrong on all of this, on the communication side, on the local MLA's role in this, making sure that they communicated with the general public, because we were all so invested, and lack thereof. So this is really going to be a learning opportunity for the government, because every mistake that they could have made, they did.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. It feels like someone should do a review of how this happened. How did it occur for so long? Why were no off ramps taken? Like this letter that came at the end basically just kind of repeated the same information that the family had already given the government, that we'd already talked about on the show, and somehow that was the deciding factor. I don't know. Jeff, what do you think of all this, where we've ended up, and Allie's idea of like, somebody's got to figure out how this went wrong so that it doesn't happen for government again?
I think that this is a story of a failure to pay attention to detail and a failure to apply appropriate political and policy judgment on an issue that affects someone in a real material way. I think at the outset of this whole matter, there was information from the government conveys to the public about how certain they were about the evidence that they gotten from everyone, including the Canada Drug Agency. And as it turns out, the broader health expert community, and particularly on this disease, was not consulted. And information that they had and that they thought was important to convey to government wasn't considered. And so, at its core, the fundamental policy decision made by government was made with a lack of attention to detail. We talked about this on the show before, and you assume when the information comes from government, maybe this is naive, probably is, that it's correct, particularly on an issue as charged as this one, and it wasn't. And I think if you're a minister, when you see this kind of public outcry, you got to feel in your gut, and this is where the political judgment comes in. You got to feel in your gut that something's wrong. And if your officials are telling you, no, you've got to do this, and in your gut you feel that it's wrong, that should be a signal to you that you need to take a different course. So I'm glad government has moved on this. I hope there's an apology, and I hope there's steps put in place to make sure that on this drug issue and on the broader coverage of drugs issue, that there is a review with recommendations for action that come from it that the government follows.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a good point. Jillian, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's bizarre. This is such a rare disease. There's only so many experts, as we saw in that letter, about a dozen of them that work on this. It's very odd that they were not consulted after the first kind of public pushback over the issue. And then I think as well, it's a time for the government to sort of reconsider how they are communicating on this issue. I think Osborne was chosen because the government really needed an empathetic communicator on health because of all the other issues that people are having accessing care and ER closures and all of that. And I think, there's some work to be done there. I don't doubt that she's capable of it, but I think that there is a lot more that they could do to be coming off less clinical and more human on health issues.
Yeah. And definitely, I think the framing from the beginning that this is science versus politics and politicians have no role in any of this was wrong. It was the wrong framing for an issue where the science isn't settled. And it removed, unfortunately, for the government, the ability for politicians to do what they should have done earlier on, which is apply the judgment Jeff was talking about to say something isn't quite landing here with the public. But I think I've watched many governments make many mistakes over the years. And some of the judgment here reminds me of when the Liberal government tried to take away people's disability bus passes. And they reversed faster than this government reversed on this issue. So I think the real problem, if I was a New Democrat, I would be very worried that the decision-making on this, from the minister's office to the premier's office to the premier himself to the minister herself, was off. And if you don't do something about that, you're going to end up in an even worse file on a worse issue at some point. So I think that's the real concern for New Democrats is, man, you got to learn something from this or else you are in a tough spot going forward. Jeff, you want to?
I still think that it's not appropriate for politicians to insert themselves in decisions about what drugs work and aren't. I think it's a politician's role, though, to say we need to have all of the evidence. We need to have consulted with every expert, not just in Canada, but the broader community elsewhere. And if they'd done that, the decision would have been very, very different than the one that had been made. And it would have been evidence-based, and we wouldn't be here today.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Let's move on to the cabinet shuffle that occurred this week. A mini shuffle, I guess. This is the third cabinet from Premier David Eby in 3 years. There are two new faces brought into the cabinet. There are two or three demotions. There's 6 folks moved around. It's 10 people out of a 24-person cabinet. This cabinet was 8 months old since the election. So your main takeaway, let's just go around and talk about our main takeaway, and then we'll dig into some of the actual sort of people here. The premier framed this as a world has changed. We need to respond to U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs, Jillian. Did you see that in this cabinet shuffle? And what do you think of that framing?
I think that's part of what occurred yesterday. I think, and then there was some other sort of more defensive moves sort of hidden underneath that framing. Obviously, the big one that fits with how the premier framed it is moving Ravi Kala into the jobs ministry. That's interesting because in other times that might be seen as a demotion. The jobs ministry is a little bit smaller than housing, but I think that really speaks to the shifting priorities. We also saw a renaming of that ministry to economic growth, which again, I think we've been talking about this a lot, a shift in the government's priorities to really focus on growth to resolve the fiscal situation and address the tariff threat. So it's going to be interesting to see how that ministry expands, if it does, and what kind of traction Minister Kalon is able to actually get, or if it becomes like he's sort of more the government's chief communicator. We've seen the finance minister at times fall short, I think, on communications, and Kalon is really strong on that file and on that front on communications. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what the balance of if that ministry is actually expanded or if it kind of is a little bit more of a communications exercise. On the defensive side, I think the biggest one was getting rid of Beg in Solicitor General and Public Safety. That was a bizarre move. I think the government put him in because of the tight margins with which he won his seat. But I think if you're going to do that, you should give someone an easy ministry, right? Like tourism or transport. That's a tough one. Public safety is one of the issues where the government has taken the most criticism over, and they really need to have a strong communicator and a strong minister that can speak to the public on the file and also advocate to Ottawa, because the province is in a situation where there's not a lot more they can do, especially when it comes to bail reform. So it's going to be interesting also to see if Nina Krieger is able to get traction on that, because it's been slow moving.
I think you're right on Big, but I think that's the ministry he wanted. He's a former RCMP officer. You know, they gave him what he wanted for winning a riding by 22 votes. That gave the NDP their one vote majority, and didn't seem like he was necessarily up to the task on that. Nina Krieger is interesting because she has rookie MLA from Victoria, no policing experience, but has experience in the anti-racism file, ran a Holocaust museum. The Premier cited those things, Allie, in naming her. But boy, is that a big file to get up to speed on when people are mad about public safety in downtown cores across the province. I asked her, I was like, do you think there's going to be willingness for people to meet with you and brief you and tell you how things are going? Do they want to reinvent the wheel, or do they want you to be moving on this kind of stuff? So that feels like a challenge for her.
It does, but I also wonder if there were other considerations in choosing her. Like, did she work well with her other colleagues? Did she ask the right questions? Like, part of the becoming a cabinet minister is to really just dedicate your life to this portfolio. And so I wonder if those characteristics really put her up for this job in a positive way. You know, to be honest, though, I think for the most part, when people kind of started hearing rumors about the cabinet shuffle, we were all waiting to see if health was going to be impacted more so. Just given all of the failures of health, all of the communication issues that we were talking about that even aren't isolated to the one Charlie story. But I really just want to know how that conversation went with Evie and Osborne of, okay, I'm going to give you another shot on this one versus maybe we need to shift you out. Maybe we need to add a parliamentary secretary position to your role. And then what it means to me is that either there was a circumstance where, yes, I'm going to give you another shot, please do better this time, or else the next time, like, I'm going to have no choice other than to shift you out. Or is he planning on something else where he is going to just end up hiring in the Premier's office for that support for this role? And on one side, it's not shocking, but on just given what EB has done in the past. But then on the other side, I just think that it really leads to, these backroom deals when your minister is responsible for doing something in a very transparent way with mandate letters and those responsibilities. It signals to us that, okay, this is the person accountable for it. But what EB has done with the Ministry of Health is essentially opened the door for, I'm going to take parts of this because you're not doing your job. And we have no line of sight as to what actually happens within the Premier's office. So I think this one's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, good points. Jeff, what do you think of all this?
Well, first of all, it's sad to see the Jobs, Economic Development and Innovation name change to Jobs, Economic Growth, because the acronym for the first ministry was JEDI, and everyone took great pleasure in being able to call it the JEDI ministry. It's gone now. Rest in peace, JEDI. Welcome, Jobs and Economic Growth. JEG, less good. My big takeaway is that I think folks have touched on it. It's a mixed bag. I think the move of Ravi Kalon into Jobs and Economic Growth is a huge positive for government. The old cabinet was named before Trump. Since Trump, housing ministry was the most important. Now jobs and economic growth is clearly the most important. So you have Kalon moving from the most important then to the most important. Now it's a great fit because he has strong relationships with the business community. He's pragmatic. He's focused on getting things done. I think it's less about communications and more about here's someone who in housing, by all accounts, pushed through a very significant amount of legislation and measures. And we're starting to see the impact of that in the housing market. I think it was a choice between Ravi and Adrian Dix for that role, the two people in government who are most attuned to the government's economic agenda and behind Bill 15 in their guts and in their heart. You could have seen a scenario where there was a super ministry of energy and economic development, but the premier chose what he chose here. And so, but I think comments from folks here about, and yourself, about some ministers being moved into parliamentary secretary roles or to a more junior ministry are right on. The one that I think it's most interesting that we haven't talked about is Indigenous relations and reconciliation. If you're in the business community and you're trying to build a major project, one of the most challenging aspects of your work is the engagement that you do with First Nations. This is a ministry that is hugely economy focused now. You have a new minister in there, Spencer Chandra Herbert, who's a heck of a guy, a hard worker, but boy howdy, that's a complex ministry. And it's going to be a challenge for him, as it is for the whole government, to make that ministry work and get stuff done.
I sort of got the impression from Spencer's move to Indigenous relations that maybe the real heavy lifting on Indigenous relations is going to be project by project agreements run out of different ministries, like by Adrian Dix or by Ravi Kalon or even by the Premier's office itself.
Yeah,
not
mines,
through Indigenous
forestry.
relations.
Yeah.
That feels like that might be where it's going. What about, Jillian, housing? We have Christine Boyle moved to housing. That's still a huge file. I mean, the housing sector is undergoing tons of turmoil right now. Government's trying to continue to build and support. It's actually, this government's in the weird position now of trying to support developers to keep their high-rise concrete condos from failing in market conditions. But I don't think I would not put Christine Boyle as the face you would have on that policy, but it's an interesting choice for that and some of the other names you might be seeing.
Yeah, well, as Jeff mentioned, the government has kind of gotten through all its legislation to reform how housing gets approved and developed, and now it's time to implement. And Boyle was on Vancouver City Council for a long time. She understands how things work at that level, and also why sometimes they don't work. I imagine she's sat through a lot of hearings and hearing opposition and knows the sticking points when it comes to actually moving things forward. And she actually was like pretty pro density as a city councilor. I think a little bit more maybe focused on nonprofit and co-op housing, but that's another priority of the government. And I think they're kind of hoping that she'll be able to speak to local governments on their level and help resolve some of the sticking points as they actually try to implement their legislation. I also wonder, I think getting the Indigenous relations file as your first file as a minister, like she did, and then having to work through bills 14 and 15 in the last session, I imagine was quite challenging. And I wonder if this was to kind of give her something a little bit different, and just sort of mix things up and freshen things up, because I imagine that was pretty challenging.
No, it's a good point. And she also has municipal affairs as well as part of that, as you were saying, that kind of relationship with municipalities. Allie, Diana Gibson, demoted to citizen services from jobs. The Premier disputes that characterization, says it's not a demotion, but citizen services is not an incredibly high-profile ministry, especially now that AI has been taken out of it to a Minister of State, Rick Glumac, who's also in charge of new technology, which is an incredible posting for a guy who almost brought the government down because he didn't know how to unblur his Zoom background for a virtual vote. But nonetheless, what do you think of Diana Gibson being moved there? And I think there were some concerns from the business community about maybe not moving fast enough, about not listening, about not being in the kind of role that the Premier seems to want Kalon to do.
I mean, talk about one of the most important files that has a little bit with every sector. And so there's so many opportunities to do your job well. And there were a lot of criticisms that she just wasn't fit for the role. So you could spin it however you want to spin it. This was 100% demotion. It's so interesting that you bring up Rick Glumac, because I like to call him the go away green. So at Disney, they have this color that they use for like ugly things so that you don't notice it and you focus on like the bright shiny castles. And Glumac like is that. Like never once have we ever heard like him do anything well. Or like think about this. Ravi Kahlon and him were both elected in 2017. And Ravi Kahlon has done incredible things and he has made progress on files. Whereas Rick Glumac, despite, having this tech background and he's very impressive, have we ever brought him up in a significant way for a significant contribution in this province? He is the go away green of this cabinet. Like, I just think it's such a odd choice, especially when you have people like George Anderson. Like that would have been such a great opportunity to promote someone that was a city councillor. And I'll argue a very wise strategic move to make politically, just given that now I would consider that a battleground area for the NDP, given that it's a conservative MP that is responsible for Nanaimo, and he's smart and not the go-away green type, but missed opportunity for Anderson. I mean, let's see what Glumac does.
Yeah, although, the Premier did elevate Jesse Sutter, a Labour lawyer, to post-secondary, which a lot of folks are looking at as a possible star kind of candidate, starting her off on a path to sort of prove her way up to the front bench of cabinet. So that's, but you're right. George Anderson I was surprised that he did not get picked here for anything. But we are out of time.
Wait, before we end, go away green. I understand there's a new political book out on the market about a former BC Liberal cabinet minister. What's it called? Get Rich? The Rich Coleman book. The Rich Coleman story. Available on Amazon.
Okay.
Where we get books.
It's good promotion there. All right. Thank you to the panel for being here. Thank you for watching and listening. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.